When Delaware experiences disasters, emergencies, and major events, we rely on our state and local government entities and nonprofits to support the immediate needs of our citizens and communities. Following a disaster event, local governments conduct an initial damage assessment, which is required to seek the potential federal funding our state needs to support disaster response and recovery through a federally declared disaster. In preparing for this FEMA declaration, it's important to understand the roles and responsibilities every entity has in this process. Potential applicants identify damages and potentially eligible emergency protective measure costs with supporting documentation, including estimates or actual costs to submit to the local emergency manager. Local emergency managers then compile the damage assessment information and submit it to DEMA. DEMA coordinates with potential applicants through local emergency managers, validating damages and initial cost estimates submitted and compiled for each county. Delaware's ability to seek grant funding is based firstly on identifying damages, comparing state and local per capita indicators, and other event impacts. FEMA then supports the joint preliminary damage assessment process, validating damage eligibility before an official disaster declaration request is made and a presidential disaster declaration is potentially granted. Per capita indicators for Delaware determine the dollar amount of damages in order to meet minimum disaster qualifications. These indicators are established by the federal government and are based on the most recent census. By documenting all expenses to validate minimum financial impacts have been met, DEMA is able to apply for federal grant support, helping to maximize available disaster resources for the state. Each potential applicant must consider whether they will be able to satisfy FEMA's eligibility requirements based on the applicant, facility, work, and cost. Documentation is required to validate eligible damages and costs associated with the disaster. Applicants should gather documentation like insurance coverage, contract estimates and invoices, as well as photos and additional records. Note, there are certain expenses that are ineligible. These will not be included in damage assessment estimates by FEMA. Ensuring a complete package of all recorded costs will help validate damage costs before submitting a request for joint preliminary damage assessment to FEMA. At the conclusion of a successful joint preliminary damage assessment, the Governor of Delaware will request an official disaster declaration. Once the disaster declaration has been approved, DEMA and FEMA will hold an in-depth applicant briefing meeting with all potential applicants to guide them through the next step in the process. So what can you do now as a potential applicant? Ensure that you're ready to submit your request for public assistance by confirming eligibility, gathering all documentation, and keeping alert for updates and disaster declaration approvals. For additional resources and to learn more, visit dema.delaware.gov.